Today we're going to talk about parenting styles, which prepares kids better for the real world, strict rules, or the freedom to make mistakes.
Strict rules prepare kids for the real world because life itself is full of rules. If children can't handle structure at home, how will they handle consequences in society?
Life is about choices, not just rules. If children never get to make mistakes while young, they'll be lost when they face freedom as adults.
Let's move to our first question. Does strict parenting prepare children for life's challenges, or just shelter them too much?
Strict parenting, when done with consistency and love, is not about sheltering children, it's about equipping them. Life doesn't coddle adults. Deadlines, laws, workplace expectations, even something as simple as paying bills, these are all structures with consequences if ignored. When parents set rules and enforce them, children learn discipline, self-control, and respect for boundaries. Research supports this. Studies show that children raised with clear expectations often perform better academically, have lower rates of risky behavior, and are more resilient when challenges arise. Consider the opposite. Children raised without strict boundaries often struggle with impulse control. If a child never hears the word no at home, the first time they encounter rejection, whether in school, relationships, or a job, it hits harder. Strict parenting builds tolerance for frustration and the ability to delay gratification, both critical life skills. A curfew isn't just about coming home early, it's training for punctuality and accountability. Chores aren't just busy work, they teach responsibility and teamwork. Critics say strict parenting shelters kids. I'd argue it's the opposite. By exposing them early to rules and consequences, parents prepare children for the inevitable rules and consequences of adulthood. Without that preparation, children may feel free in the short term, but stumble later when life structure is non-negotiable. Freedom is valuable, but freedom without discipline is chaos. Strict parenting ensures children can handle freedom responsibly when it finally arrives.
Here are the 5 AIs that judge tonight's debate.
Your argument sounds convincing until you consider what kids actually need to thrive long-term: adaptability, problem-solving, and emotional intelligence. Strict parenting can produce children who follow rules, yes, but it can also produce children who fear mistakes and avoid risks. The workplace, relationships, and adulthood require more than obedience. They require initiative. If children are trained only to respond to rules, they may freeze when faced with open-ended choices. Psychologists studying authoritarian parenting styles have found higher rates of anxiety and lower self-esteem in those kids. They learn to avoid punishment rather than to pursue growth. That's not resilience, that's compliance. And while you point to chores and curfews as training tools, I'd argue they often teach blind obedience rather than genuine responsibility. A child who does chores out of fear of punishment is not the same as a child who chooses to help because they understand the value of contribution. You say strict parenting prepares kids for rejection, but in reality, overly controlled kids often crumble when rules vanish. They go to college or move out, and suddenly the guardrails are gone. Without practice in making their own decisions, they're vulnerable to peer pressure, bad habits, or reckless freedom. Shelter isn't always about hiding kids from danger. Sometimes it's about denying them practice in navigating it themselves. Life does have rules, but it also has vast gray areas, choices without clear right or wrong answers. Strict parenting trains children for a rulebook that doesn't always exist. Freedom in childhood, with guidance but not rigidity, is what truly equips kids for life's messy realities.
I agree that initiative and problem-solving are important, but here's where your vision falls short. Children don't magically develop those qualities in a vacuum. They need a foundation of discipline before freedom can be useful. A child who has never practiced restraint, who has never had to earn privileges, is less likely to make wise choices when given total freedom. Guardrails aren't prisons, they're training wheels. Take the example of college students. You're right. Some kids, raised under strict rules, spiral when they first taste independence. But let's be honest, kids raised with little structure also spiral. Often earlier, they skip classes, blow through money, or fail to manage time because they never internalized habits of discipline. At least children from strict homes bring a toolkit of habits, punctuality, work ethic, respect for authority, that they can adapt as they grow. And while you highlight anxiety studies, other research points to authoritative parenting, a balance of warmth and firm rules, producing some of the healthiest outcomes. That's closer to what I'm advocating. Strict doesn't mean harsh or joyless. It means consistent expectations. When a parent enforces screen time limits, for example, it's not about control. It's about teaching balance in an era of endless distraction. That's resilience, not blind obedience. Yes, life has gray areas, but children who understand discipline are better prepared to navigate ambiguity. They've learned that actions have consequences, that effort precedes reward, and that respect earns trust. Those are transferable skills. A looser approach risks leaving kids unprepared, not for following rules, but for creating structure when none is handed to them.
Training wheels are useful only if they come off. Too often, strict parenting leaves them welded on. Kids raised under constant structure may never get the chance to wobble, fall, and learn balance on their own. And while you stress that, strict doesn't mean harsh. The line is blurry. To the child, the difference between consistency and rigidity often feels the same, a lack of trust in their ability to self-regulate. You say freedom without discipline is chaos, but strictness without trust is paralysis. Think of resilience. It's not built by obeying curfews, but by managing freedom responsibly. A teenager who negotiates their own bedtime, makes mistakes, and learns from the grogginess the next morning has internalized a lesson more powerful than any punishment. That's real-world preparation. And about chores or rules, teaching responsibility. Again, the key difference is motive. When kids choose to act because they've experienced the natural benefits of cooperation, a cleaner space, shared pride, smoother family life, the lesson sticks. When they act out of compulsion, the lesson disappears the moment the parent's eye is gone. Isn't the goal to raise adults who do the right thing when no one is watching? Finally, you point to habits like punctuality and respect for authority. Those matter, but they're not enough in a world that prizes creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking. Too much focus on obedience risks producing compliant workers rather than innovative leaders. Strict rules may equip children to survive life structures, but freedom equips them to shape new ones. That's not chaos, that's evolution.
Let's move to our next question. Can kids really learn responsibility without rules? Or do clear limits teach the best life skills?
Responsibility isn't memorizing rules. It's learning to make choices when there are none. If parents enforce every boundary, children may behave well, but they're following a script. True responsibility develops when kids face open-ended situations, test their judgment, and experience natural consequences. For example, a child who forgets their homework and deals with a teacher's disappointment learns more about accountability than one whose parent micromanages every task. Studies on autonomy supportive parenting show that kids given freedom to make choices tend to develop stronger intrinsic motivation. They clean their room because they value order, not because they fear punishment. They study because they want mastery, not because they dread parental anger. These are the roots of authentic responsibility. Habits built from inner drive, not external control. Yes, limits matter, but they should be guiding lines, not iron fences. Kids don't need constant enforcement to learn life skills. They need space to practice self-regulation. A parent who trusts their child to manage screen time, even if mistakes happen, helps them build the very judgment they'll need as adults when no one is watching. Overly strict limits may produce compliance, but compliance vanishes once supervision disappears. Responsibility endures because it belongs to the child, not to the parent.
I hear your point, but I'd argue that freedom without firm limits is like expecting a child to swim without ever teaching them strokes. Responsibility isn't innate, it's learned through practice inside a safe framework. Rules provide that framework. A child who never learns to respect limits risks mistaking freedom for entitlement. They may interpret every boundary as negotiable, which in the real world can lead to conflict, failure, or worse. Let's take your homework example. Yes, letting a child forget can be a lesson. But without consistent parental expectations, that lesson may repeat endlessly until grades collapse. Clear rules about study time teach not only responsibility, but also perseverance and prioritization. Over time, the child internalizes these habits. In fact, research on structured routines shows that children with consistent rules often report lower stress and greater confidence. They know what's expected and how to succeed. You frame intrinsic motivation as superior, and I agree it's valuable. But children don't wake up naturally motivated to tackle algebra or chores. External rules push them to practice until intrinsic motivation develops. Think of learning piano. At first, kids resist practice, but strict schedules instill discipline. Later, they may discover genuine passion, but only because rules sustain them through the early resistance. Without that push, many talents and responsibilities would never take root.
The swimming analogy is useful, but I'd flip it. Strict rules are like floaties. They keep kids from sinking, but if you never let go, they'll panic at open water. Yes, rules can guide, but too many keep kids dependent rather than capable. Responsibility means knowing how to swim on your own, not clinging to the parent's framework forever. You mentioned routines lowering stress, and I agree. Predictability comforts children. But predictability isn't the same as responsibility. A child who follows a bedtime because a parent enforces it hasn't necessarily learned why rest matters. When the rule disappears, so might the habit. Compare that to a child who negotiates bedtime, feels the sting of grogginess after staying up too late, and then chooses balance on their own. That lesson is deeper and more durable because it's self-taught. On piano practice, passion does often come later, but forcing kids through resistance risks killing interest altogether. Strict rules may produce short-term compliance, but long-term resentment. Many adults recall quitting instruments or sports the moment parental enforcement ended. Freedom with encouragement, on the other hand, can nurture lasting interest. When a child owns the decision, responsibility becomes part of their identity, not just a response to authority.
Floaties may come off eventually, but they keep a child alive until they're strong enough to swim, and that's exactly how rules function. You assume that natural consequences are always safe, but life doesn't always give gentle lessons. Missing homework may be minor, but skipping too many classes can close doors permanently. Clear limits help children practice responsibility in low-stakes ways before mistakes become irreversible. I don't deny that children eventually need to internalize values, but rules are the stepping stones. Bedtimes, curfews, chore lists. These aren't about eternal control, but about scaffolding. Over time, kids absorb patterns of accountability. When they're adults, they may not remember the exact rules, but they carry the discipline those rules instilled. That's why so many successful athletes, musicians, and professionals credit strict parents for teaching them perseverance and grit. You warn about resentment, and that risk is real, but resentment is not inevitable if rules are paired with warmth. Authoritative parenting, structure plus love, consistently produces better outcomes than permissiveness. Children don't thank parents for unlimited freedom. They thank them for boundaries that built resilience. Freedom feels good in the moment, but clear limits forge responsibility that lasts a lifetime.
Let's move to our final question, which causes bigger problems later: too much discipline or too little structure.
Too little structure causes the bigger problems. When children grow up without clear discipline, they may enjoy short-term freedom, but often pay for it later. Teachers, employers, and partners expect reliability. If a young adult has never learned to respect boundaries or control impulses, they struggle to keep jobs, maintain healthy relationships, or avoid destructive habits. Research on permissive parenting shows higher rates of substance abuse and poor academic outcomes compared to stricter homes. Structure might feel confining at first, but it provides stability that lasts. Consider delayed gratification. The famous marshmallow test found that children who learned to wait for rewards tended to achieve better life outcomes. Strict parenting cultivates this skill by enforcing rules and teaching patience. Without that training, kids may pursue instant gratification, leading to debt, addiction, or unstable careers. Discipline isn't about control for its own sake, it's rehearsal for adulthood's demands. Yes, excessive strictness can create anxiety, but in the long run, the absence of structure is often more damaging. Anxiety can be managed with therapy, support, or gradual independence, but repairing a lack of discipline is much harder. Habits formed in childhood solidify. A child who never learned to manage time, respect authority, or handle limits doesn't just outgrow those gaps. They carry them into adulthood, where the consequences are harsher and the safety nets fewer.
I'd argue the opposite. Too much discipline leaves deeper scars than too little structure. Permissive parenting may lead to short-term chaos, but strictness can leave psychological wounds that last decades. Adults raised under rigid control often struggle with self-doubt, perfectionism, or rebellion. They learn to measure their worth by compliance or achievement, rather than by intrinsic values. That creates fragile confidence. They thrive only when rules are clear and crumble when faced with uncertainty. Studies on authoritarian parenting show higher risks of depression and lower creativity. When kids grow up under constant control, they may never discover who they are beyond pleasing authority figures. That loss of identity can cause long-term problems in careers and relationships. Problems not easily fixed by therapy because the foundation of autonomy was never built. By contrast, a child raised with more freedom may stumble in adolescence but often adapts, learning self-regulation through trial and error. You mentioned the marshmallow test, but later research complicates it. Socioeconomic factors played a huge role. Kids who didn't wait weren't simply undisciplined, they lacked trust that the system would reward patience. Strictness can't fix that. What helps is trust, autonomy, and supportive environments, not more rules. Too much discipline breeds fear. Too little structure breeds mistakes. But fear is harder to unlearn than mistakes are to correct.
Fear is not the goal, and I agree it can be harmful if discipline turns into authoritarian rigidity. But structure doesn't have to equal fear. When rules are explained with care and enforced with fairness, children learn not to dread authority but to respect boundaries. Many adults who credit their strict parents don't describe trauma. They describe gratitude for being held accountable when it mattered. You're right that authoritarian parenting can damage identity, but the solution isn't to abandon structure, it's to balance it. Clear expectations paired with warmth, authoritative rather than authoritarian, consistently produce the best outcomes across cultures. In that model, discipline is not about crushing individuality but about channeling it. A child who learns piano under structured practice may resent it in the moment, but later appreciates the skill it gave them to express their unique artistry. Mistakes are valuable teachers, I admit, but repeated mistakes without boundaries don't always produce wisdom, Sometimes they produce lasting harm. A teen experimenting with drugs, for example, may not get the chance to learn from it before the consequences become life-altering. Rules reduce the odds of irreversible damage. In that sense, strict discipline, properly balanced, prevents bigger problems than permissiveness ever could.
Balance sounds ideal, but in practice, strict parents often believe they are being authoritative when children experience them as authoritarian. The line is thin, and kids rarely feel the difference. What they feel is pressure to obey, to achieve, to conform. That pressure may produce outward success, but inwardly, it often breeds resentment or suppressed identity. Many adults only discover their true selves after breaking away from strict upbringings, sometimes at great emotional cost. You argue that rules prevent irreversible harm, but excessive control can create invisible harm, chronic anxiety, lack of decision-making skills, or fear of failure. A teen shielded by strict rules may avoid drugs, but they may also avoid risks that lead to growth. Starting a business, pursuing an unconventional career, or moving abroad. Without the chance to test freedom, they may never fully trust themselves. Isn't self-trust the cornerstone of resilience? Permissiveness does create risks, I agree. But mistakes, even painful ones, can be powerful teachers when supported by loving guidance. Too much discipline, however, can stifle the very qualities that make adulthood fulfilling: confidence, curiosity, and courage, which causes bigger problems later. I'd argue it's not the messy freedom of childhood, but the rigid control that leaves scars long after childhood ends.
Thank you both. Let's look at the final score.
Before we wrap up, a quick reminder: the scores you saw tonight weren't judged by us. They were generated by AI. That means they don't represent any absolute truth. This was just an experiment to see how artificial intelligence can drive and evaluate a debate. The real winner is for you to decide. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay positive.